Your seat. Good afternoon and welcome to Policy Exchange. It's our huge pleasure to be jointly hosting today's event with our friends at the New Schools Network. And so to introduce our star speakers today, it's my pleasure to welcome Rachel Wolfe, their director.
Thank you. This is a really exciting event for us because we're with Policy Exchange, who really created the initial impetus behind the free school policy. And we get to welcome someone who really is a heroine for anyone who's involved in education reform in the UK, in the US, across the world. She not only transformed DC's schools, but she is now doing something which I think has never really been attempted and certainly never achieved before, which is to really create a consensus around reform and achieve reform across the United States and demonstrate what really can be done in our schools. I'm going to pass over to Michael, who I know has to leave shortly for an Opposition Day debate, to introduce Michelle and talk about all the ways he's going to do all the things she did here. But thank you for coming, and I'm so excited that Michelle's here to speak. Thank you.
I don't know how many of you are fans of BBC Radio 1, but those of you who are will know that this last weekend was their big weekend in Hackney. The big weekend in Hackney had a number of homegrown acts of varying quality before you had a single US superstar topping the bill. On that occasion, it was Rihanna. The BBC One big weekend in Hackney is being recreated here at Policy Exchange in a way, in that you have a number of homegrown acts of varying quality. Neil O'Brien, just been appointed as the Deputy Chair of the UK Government's Commission on Social Mobility, and undoubtedly the most influential think tank head in Britain today. Rachel Wolfe, who as the founder of the New Schools Network has been responsible for acting as godmother to 24 new free schools, and we hope many more to come down the line. An inspirational thought leader, but also a doer who's transformed education on the ground. And then me, ex-chairman of Policy Exchange during the years when it was a neglected and marginalised think tank, and someone who wasn't even able to keep Rachel Wolfe as an employee because she soon tired of working for me. So you can recognise where the real power balance lies between the three of us, and it's not with me. One of the reasons why I'm so glad that we were able to persuade Michelle to come to the UK is that I had admired from afar everything that she had achieved in Washington. When she was appointed by Mayor Adrian Fenty to be the individual responsible, the superintendent in charge of DC's schools, they were the worst performing in the whole of the United States. In just 2 years, Michelle ensured that they were the fastest improving schools in the whole of America. And she did so because she operated a single-minded, focused, determined philosophy. Children should come first. She recognized that many of the arrangements that we have in place which govern education are determined by adults for adults. Union rules, which allow adults to decide when they work so it's convenient for them. Decisions about curriculum and qualifications that allow adult politicians to say, over the years things have been getting better and better. Aren't I wonderful? And adult ways of arguing about politics in which one ideology clashes with another, but the genuine interests of children are forgotten. In a moment you'll hear from Michelle, both about the scale of the challenge that she took on, but also about the individual inspirational stories that sustained her in her work. The examples of those students who, as a result of Michelle's leadership, knew that schools were changing in order to ensure that they could have a better future. And Michelle's example acts both as an inspiration and also as a reproach to reformers in this country. Michelle was in charge of DC schools for a short period, but during that time she achieved amazing things. So in this country, when people say, take your time, don't rush your fences, reform has been proceeding at a rapid pace, isn't it about time that you paused to reflect? I look at what Michelle achieved, and I think about the children who were her first concern. And I believe our children don't have a second chance. They can't wait around in underperforming schools with underperforming teachers until a consensus has been reached by adult politicians that now is the right time to act. We've got to have that same sense of urgency and determination that any parent would have when they think of their own child. And the other way in which Michelle is an inspiration and a reproach is the sheer moral courage that she showed. It's often the case that those who reform are told, people aren't yet ready to move. Parents actually think this school might be worth keeping open for another year or two. They're very heavily invested in it. It's part of their community. Isn't it time? Isn't it right for you to be a bit more cautious? But the thing that Michelle realized is that she had to call out those people who were urging her to be more conservative and less confrontational. Because it was only by establishing clear moral leadership on the vital importance of transforming the schools in Washington, D.C., that she was able to overcome the sheer power of vested interests that just hoped that this pesky lady would go away. Now Michelle is operating on a national level in the United States, leading a campaign which is helping to ensure that the case for reform is made in every American city. And the changes that she's wrought in Washington, D.C., we hope will be wrought across the whole of America. Ladies and gentlemen, an inspirational reformer and a person whom it's a pleasure to welcome to London, Michelle Rhee. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that might be the first time that I have been likened to Rihanna. I think my two preteen daughters would beg to differ with that characterization. Anyways, I want to thank the Policy Exchange for inviting me here today, to Rachel and the New Schools Network for their incredible work that they have been doing on the Free Schools movement, and then the Secretary finally. It has been an absolute pleasure to learn what is happening here in Great Britain around education reform. I think that the country is absolutely headed in the right direction. And hopefully I can share some insights on things not to do, and hopefully a few lessons around successes that we had, so that you can take those lessons forward. I'm going to kind of ground my remarks today on the experiences that I had leading the Washington, D.C. public school system. So before I get too far into that, I always think it's helpful to give people a little bit of perspective and context for that job. It actually, the education reform movement there started a few months before I even stepped foot in the city. Actually, in 2006, a young upstart named Adrian Fenty, who was a very little-known politician, decided that he was going to run for mayor of the city. He did not win any endorsements. He did not raise a whole lot of money. He didn't participate in the debates. He really believed in retail politics and the idea of going out onto the streets, sitting in people's homes with them and talking about what they thought the city needed. As legend has it, in Washington, D.C., he knocked on over half of the doors in the city, and in an absolute upset to the entire political body in Washington, he was elected not only the youngest mayor ever to be elected in the city, but the only mayor ever to be elected winning every single precinct in the entire district. And what he says about his time, his 2-year time period campaigning, was that every single house that he went into, in every conversation that he had, it didn't matter what corner of the city that he was in, that the overarching refrain was, you have to fix the schools. You have to fix the schools. I heard it over and over and over again. And it really was not a huge surprise that that would be one of the main concerns of the people of Washington, D.C., because at the time, Washington, D.C. public schools were largely known as the most dysfunctional and lowest performing district in the entire country. So just to give you a sense of what that looks like on a very practical level, I'll share with you some statistics. First thing was that if you were a 9th grader entering into high school in our district, the chance that you would ever graduate from college was about 9%. We had an achievement gap in our city between where the white students were performing and where the African American students were performing of 70 percentage points. And of all of the 8th graders in the city's schools, only 8% of them were at grade level proficiency in mathematics. 8%, which means that 92% of our young people did not have the skills and knowledge necessary to be productive members of society. And potentially the most disheartening data of them all was about our little ones. And basically what that data showed was that when children came into our system as kindergartners, they came in relatively on par with other kids who looked like them in cities across the country. The problem was that the longer they stayed in our system, the further behind they fell. By the time they reached the 3rd grade, they were far below their urban counterparts. And this is a very interesting statistic. The poor black 4th graders in New York City were operating 2 full grade levels ahead of the poor black 4th graders in Washington, D.C. So for everyone who wanted to blame the low academic achievement levels of our students on single-parent households, on violence in the community, on a lack of health care, nutrition, et cetera, the last time I checked, the poverty in New York City was no different from the poverty in Southeast Washington, D.C., but the children in New York were 2 grade levels ahead of ours. So it gives you a sense of how dire the situation was. It really meant that if you were a child growing up in D.C., you were almost better off staying home every day than you were coming to school, where you were almost certain to fall behind. That was the situation. So when Adrian Fenty sort of swept into office, his first act as mayor was to introduce legislation that would allow him to take over mayoral control of the schools. He thought that the school board structure that had governed the school district was not functioning well, and that was actually adding to the dysfunction of the schools. And what he saw as diffuse accountability was in his mind the biggest problem. So he thought, I'm going to be the sole person who's going to be responsible for whether or not the schools are successful or not. So he took over mayoral control of the schools. And on the first day the control took hold, on June 12th of 2007, he announced me as his pick for the city's first schools chancellor. Now, at the time, I was a 37-year-old Korean girl from Toledo, Ohio, who had never run a school, much less a school district. And so the overarching thought of all of the citizens of Washington, D.C. at the time was, what on God's green earth is Adrian Fenty thinking? And that's pretty much what I was thinking as I was sitting in my office for the first few days trying to figure out, when you're dealing with a system where everything is broken, literally, where do you start? So I was fortunate enough to have lots of people who wanted to help, who had seen the trials and tribulations of the district over time. And interestingly enough, a lot of the advice that I got early on was that I should find out what was happening to all of the money that we were spending in the district, because we were spending more money per child than almost any other urban jurisdiction in the entire nation, and yet our results were the worst. And so when you walked into our schools, you saw these crumbling buildings and met these teachers who were spending money out of their own pocket to buy supplies for children. It did not feel to anyone in the system like we were one of the richest districts in the nation. And so I thought it made a whole lot of sense to try to figure out where all the money was going. So I sent my team out and I said, look at every spreadsheet, every line item that you need to, and try to figure out where are we spending all of these dollars, and why are we getting such a poor return on investment? So they did exactly what I said, and they came back, and about a couple of weeks later, my special assistant came into my office, and he said, Chancellor, I did exactly what you said. I studied all of the budget documents and spreadsheets and tried to look at where our biggest ticket items were, and I found 2 very interesting things. Now, in America, interesting is a euphemism in education for whack. So I knew I was in for something interesting when he said, okay, the first thing that I found was that we are spending nearly $90 million a year on busing a few thousand special education kids through the system to their school placements. So I did the quick back of the envelope math, and it turned out that that was about $18,000 per child per year on busing. And I thought, you know what? This is actually good news, because I don't know a thing about running bus routes, but I know I can do it for cheaper than $18,000 a year. For $18,000 a year, you could buy the kid a Dodge Neon for that much money, and you could hire a private chauffeur for the car every year after that. And I said, so this is great. I'm going to make the bus system more efficient. I'm going to take that savings and I'm going to push it down into the schools and the classroom where it will have more impact on kids. And he said, not so fast. You see, the system had done such a poor job of transporting kids in the past that now we are under a court order, a consent decree. And there is a court-appointed special master who is now responsible for managing the transportation system. And he's allowed to spend as much money as he wants. As long as he delivers the kids to school on time, all we're allowed to do is pay the bill at the end of the year. We have no ability to control costs. And I looked at my assistant and I said, that is the craziest thing I have ever heard. And he looked back at me and he said, that's because you haven't heard my second tidbit. He said, I was trying to figure out where are all these kids going, right? The city is only a few square miles wide and deep. And even if the buses literally did laps around the city all day long, I still don't think you could burn off $18,000 worth of gas a year. He said, so what I realized was that these kids were not being bused to our schools. We were not just doing a poor job of transporting the special needs children to their schools, we were also doing a poor job of educating them once they got there. We did not give them the resources and the supports that they were legally entitled to. So a culture grew up where the parents would sue the district. They would inevitably win because we had in fact done a poor job with their kids. And then the court, as a remedy, would assign the child to a private school, and we would be obligated to pay the tuition to that school. And these schools are not in the district. A lot of them are in far-flung places like Maryland and Virginia. And so you literally have a situation where in, say, a given housing complex has 10 special needs kids who live there. In the morning, you have 10 different buses with 10 different bus drivers and 10 different bus matrons who line up to pick up 10 different kids who are all sent off to 10 different schools in far-flung places across the region, sometimes traveling 2 hours there and back every day. That's how we were spending $18,000 a year on transportation. So I said to myself, I knew I was going to have to fix the public education system. I had no idea that I was also subsidizing the private school system here. How exactly does this kind of dynamic arise? And he said, this is exactly what I was trying to figure out. And he said, and so I did the research and I looked into how this happens. And he said, I found an example, which I think elucidates the situation. So let me just, tell you how this happens. He said, I found one woman, an employee, a mid-level employee in the district bureaucracy. In 1 week, she made 2 mistakes. With one child, she did not fill out a form she was supposed to fill out. With another child, she didn't have a meeting she was supposed to have. And in both of these cases, it resulted in these 2 children getting sent to a private facility that cost this district $227,000 a year in tuition. So I said, wow, I'm going to have to meet this lady. So my assistant calls her and he says, ma'am, we need you to come to a meeting at the chancellor's office tomorrow at 5 o'clock. And the woman replies, well, I'm going to have to check with my supervisor on that. My assistant said, ma'am, the chancellor is your supervisor. She's everyone's supervisor. And she said, well, okay, I'll come, but I'm going to bring my lawyer with me. He said, bring whoever you need to bring, just show up at 5 o'clock. So the next day rolls around, 5 o'clock, I walk into my conference room, there she is. And I said, I understand that you had a question about whether you should come to this meeting today. She said, no, I was just, a little freaked out. I'm okay now, I'm here. I said, great. So I pull out the files and I said, this kid, you didn't fill out the form, this kid, you didn't have the meeting. I said, with 2 mistakes, you cost this district nearly $500,000. Help me understand how that happened. And she looked at me and she said, well, you need to understand that I am a very busy person. She said, I have lots of meetings to go to. I have lots of forms I have to fill out. So many kids in my caseload. Things are going to fall through the cracks. That's just the way it is. And I looked at her and I said, no, you need to understand that if you believe this job is too big for you, then you need to go find another job. I said, but if you are going to take the paycheck home every other week, then you have to take responsibility for doing everything within your job purview and doing it well. And she looks at me and she says, but that's not fair. Literally. And it was after I had several discussions with central office employees that were along these lines, where they were literally taking no personal responsibility for the jobs that they were hired to do every day, that I did what I think any CEO in a turnaround situation does. I started to fire people. That did not go over well. So about 5 days into this new action, my then general counsel runs into my office. He shuts the door, so I knew I was in trouble, and he said, Chancellor Rhee, you have got to stop firing people. And I said, why? If we have employees that aren't doing their jobs, we need to move them out, and we need to move in people who will do the jobs. And he said, welcome to the DC public schools and to civil service, where we never fire anyone. And I said, you know what? I know you're exaggerating. I've talked to lots of people. I know that it actually is possible to remove an employee from their service. I don't want to break any rules. Just tell me what the process is, and I will follow the process. And he said, well, there are only 2 ways that you can terminate an employee from the DC public school system. I said, great, give me the first way. He said, you have to have done something egregious. And I said, well, that's perfect, because everyone that I'm talking about is egregiously incompetent. And he said, no, doesn't count. Egregious only has really 2 meanings. Either you have to have hit a child, and you have to have a videotape to prove it, because the principal and 5 other teachers witnessing it is not enough. Or you have to have stolen money from the district, and we have to essentially have the bank receipt to prove it. Short of that, nothing counts as egregious. I said, okay, that's not good news. Give me the second way that I can fire someone. He said, well, you have to show a recurring pattern of incompetence. And I said, well, that shouldn't be a problem. These people did not magically become incompetent the moment that I walked in the door. Surely we ought to be able to show that there's been a pattern. And he said, that's what you would think. But what you don't know, Chancellor, is that for 10 years in the central office, no employee has received a performance evaluation. And in order to meet the legal letter of the law of showing the documentation of a recurring pattern, you have to have their performance evaluations, but since nobody has ever had a performance evaluation, we can't use that route either. And I thought, okay, this is really troublesome. So I asked him, I said, so what am I supposed to do with people who are not performing their jobs well? I certainly can't allow them to stay here and come in to the office every day. And he said, well, you can do what we normally do. We send them down to the schools. I said, are you kidding me? I'm trying to get these people away from children, not put them closer to. So at the time, I decided that I was going to send these people home. Because if you think about it, I paid this mid-level employee about $40,000 a year. She comes in on any given week, makes 2 mistakes, cost me $500,000. My best cost-cutting mechanism is to let her stay home for a little while I figure it out. And at the same time, I went to my boss, the new mayor, and I said, sir, you brought me in to do a difficult job, but the difficult job turns into an impossible job if I can't build the team of people that I think are talented enough to lead the transformation of this department. So he looks at me and he says, well, you know what? If we don't like the rules of the game, then we should change the rules. So he introduced legislation to the city council that would allow us to make central office employees at-will employees. That was firestorm number 2, after my appointment, number 2 in the city, where people were incredibly unhappy. In fact, the most interesting day of my entire career in DC was probably the day of the city council hearing about this legislation. The hearing itself lasted for 14 hours. So all day long, people were coming in and out of the hearing room, banging on the table, yelling and screaming, Michelle Rhee is evil, she is a dictator, you know. And what was fascinating to me was that over the course of the 14 hours, there was very little to no talk of children, of schools, or of student achievement. All of the talk was about due process and job security and workers' rights, et cetera, et cetera. And I was thinking to myself, are you kidding me? the children of this city can't exercise their rights. If you are a child in the 3rd grade who didn't learn the 3rd grade skills that you needed, there was no appeals board that you could go to, say, please refund my parents' taxpayer dollars back because I didn't learn what I was supposed to learn in the 3rd grade. No, we would just pass you on to the next grade without the skills and knowledge that you needed to be successful in life, and yet all of the adults would keep their jobs and their contracts, etc. That was a little idea of the dysfunction that was going on that led the district to be one of the worst performing school districts in the country. And let me be very clear that the system did not become that way by accident. There were people all throughout the city who were benefiting from the fact that we were as dysfunctional as we were, because they could have jobs and contracts and not have to deliver anything for that money year in and year out. So when we began to change the way that we were operating and hold people accountable, it got people very, very upset and angry. Despite that, the mayor made it very clear to everyone in the city that he was prioritizing schools and school reform above anything else. In fact, everywhere that he went, all he talked about was schools, schools, schools. He believed that you could not have a great city without having a great school system, and that the city would never meet its potential until we had a great public school system. In that period of time, we made more changes to the DC public schools than certainly the district had ever seen before, and potentially any district anywhere in the States. But it did pay off, despite the fact that we had to close over 30 schools, that we removed about 1,000 educators from their position, and about 2/3 of the principals who were leading schools in the district. We also went from being the worst performing school district in the country to the highest growth district in the nation, according to the NAEP examination, which is a national examination. And we were also the only school district in the 3-year period that I was there to see double-digit growth in both reading and math at the secondary level. So though we were just beginning our journey, we were absolutely beginning to see the fruits of our labor. Now, what is interesting to me is that when you look at any bureaucracy that exists, and most school districts, departments of education, et cetera, have very sort of similar dynamics that play out in it. It can be somewhat disheartening. So you can look at all of those things and say, is it possible to ever fix these things? And I always had a high degree of confidence that we were going to be able to fix the system. So I would go out every day and I would make speeches to different groups like this, policymakers and Rotary clubs, et cetera. And it was interesting because inevitably, after all of my talks, people would come up to me and say, you know what, Michelle, we like you. You seem enthusiastic, energetic, you're very motivated, but you are not going to be successful. And I'd always say, gee, thanks for the vote of confidence. Why do you think so? And they'd say, because schools are a reflection of the communities that they're in. And as long as you have the economic disparity in the country that you do, then you will always have an educational inequity. Because in some neighborhoods, you have extreme wealth and power, and people are invested and civically engaged. And in those communities, you're going to have high-performing schools. And then in other communities, you're going to have poverty and violence and a lack of resources. And in those communities, you are going to have less good schools. That's the way capitalism and democracy work. Get used to it, kiddo, is what they used to say. And I never, ever believed that that is what had to be the case. But I also didn't really know how to articulate to people, sort of make a case for something better. And it wasn't until about a year and a half into my tenure in DC that I had the very good fortune of meeting Warren Buffett. So first of all, never in my life, folks, would I ever think that somebody like me would have the opportunity to meet one of the richest men in the world. But there I was one night in Omaha, Nebraska, which is where Mr. Buffett lives, having a steak dinner with Warren Buffett. And halfway through the dinner, he looks up at me and he says, Michelle, it is very easy to fix the problems in public education in America today. This is one of the smartest, richest men in the world. I'm like, great, Mr. Buffett. Tell me what the answer is so I can run back to DC and implement it. And he says, all you have to do is make private schools illegal and assign every child to a public school by random lottery. So if you think about that for a moment, Had we done that in DC, that would have meant that every CEO's child, every ambassador's child, every congressman's child, and the president's 2 babies would have all gotten assigned to a random DC public school by lottery, which means that a huge proportion of them would have been going to Anacostia, one of the poorest neighborhoods in the entire country, every day for school. I guarantee you that had that happened, we would have never seen a faster movement of resources from one side of the city to the other, as you would in that circumstance. And I also guarantee you that very quickly, we would have a system of excellent schools. So the question in my mind is not, is it possible to accomplish this in a particular country? The answer to that question is absolutely. The real question is, do we, as the adults who are leading the system, have the wherewithal that it would take to make the incredibly difficult decisions necessary to make that a reality for every child? And the answer to that question so far has been no. But despite all that, I still have tremendous confidence in what is possible in school reform. And since we are at a policy think tank today, let me share with you the 2 things that I think our country would have to do to change the dynamic for kids. And hopefully it will have some lessons for you as you do your work here. The first thing in America that we have to do is really ensure that politicians, policymakers, administrators are making every decision for children based on what they would do for their own kids. So let me explain to you why I think this is important. When I got my job in DC, I made the decision that I was going to send my own 2 daughters, 10 and 13, to the DC public schools. Now, my family and friends thought I was absolutely mad. They said, this is the worst school district in the country. You cannot forsake your children for your job, et cetera, et cetera. But I thought to myself, you know, I want to be in a position where the decisions that I'm making every day are going to impact my own 2 kids. And if I'm expecting, tens of thousands of parents to entrust me with their children every day, then I certainly should entrust them, my own kids, to myself, right? So I decided to do this. And it really did change and shape everything that I did. So let me give you a quick example. We put in place a new teacher evaluation system in the city, and it was much, much overdue. And let me tell you why. I told you earlier that when I inherited the district, 8% of the 8th graders were on grade level in mathematics. Well, at that same time, I checked and looked at the performance evaluations of the teachers in the system. The central office did not have performance evaluations, but the teachers did. And as it turned out, 98% of the teachers were being rated as doing an excellent job. So how can you possibly have a system, a functioning environment, an organization, where all the employees were running around thinking, I'm doing great work, and what we were producing for kids was 8% success? The misalignment was just staggering. So we knew that we had to begin to differentiate amongst our teaching force. We put in place a new teacher evaluation system, which had 4 categories of performance: highly effective, effective, minimally effective, and ineffective. For the highly effective teachers, it was easy. We wanted to recognize and reward them, and we set up a pay scheme where essentially, if you were a highly effective teacher who was teaching in a high-need school, in a high-need subject area, you could make twice as much money in the new system that you did in the old system. So there was a tremendous upside for effective teachers. But then the conversation turned to, what do we do with ineffective teachers? And there was a pretty vigorous argument going on within my senior staff about, needing to invest in the workforce, et cetera, and we should give teachers who have been rated as ineffective as 1 or 2 years to improve their practice. It's the right thing to do for those adults, et cetera. And as I was listening to the whole debate, I thought to myself, if I am going to take a teacher who I know has already been rated as ineffective, and the argument is that we should give that person another year or 2 to see if they might get better, then I have to be comfortable knowing that one of my own 2 children could be placed in that person's classroom the following year. And I will tell you that as a mother, I would never make that decision for my children. No one in this room would ever do that for their own 2 children. And so I thought, if I'm not willing for my own 2 kids to go into an ineffective teacher's classroom, then I'm certainly not going to put any other parent in this city in the position where they are going to have to do that. So I do think that this makes a difference. And it was interesting to me because I got a tremendous amount of pushback on the sort of policies that I was putting in place. Another policy that I introduced was that in the time of layoffs, which we were suffering from some economic hardships, and so we did have layoffs have to occur in the city. Prior to our arrival, the layoffs had always been done by seniority, meaning last in, first out. If you were the last person hired, you had to be the first person fired, regardless of performance. The law made absolutely no sense whatsoever, and so we decided that we were going to do these layoffs by quality instead of seniority. And what it allowed us to do was allowed every principal to determine who was adding the least amount of value into their school, and those were the teachers that we laid off. Now, in some schools that had great staffs, it meant that, inevitably a new teacher would have to be laid off. But in a lot of schools, it meant that a problematic, ineffective teacher who had been in that school for some time would be the one that would be lost. So we managed to lay off some of the most ineffective teachers in the entire district through this layoff policy. And what was fascinating to me was that when we had to do this layoff, it was 266 teachers. It caused firestorm number 3 in the city, so it was very, very tumultuous. And at one point, there was an elected official who, demanded of me, I want you right now, today, to reinstate every single one of those 266 teachers. They were wrongfully terminated. This process that you set out was absolutely the wrong one. And I looked at him and I said, I'll tell you what. You have 4 children, none of whom attend the DC public schools. If you agree to bring one of your kids back into the system and allow me to randomly assign them to the classroom of one of the teachers, the ineffective teachers that I've laid off, then I will bring that, and I will save that person's job. And if you bring back 2 of your kids, I will bring back 2 of the teachers. And if you can get your family to bring all the nieces and nephews and cousins back, for every one of your family members who you are willing to subject to the teaching prowess of one of these teachers, I will bring back any number of these teachers. Needless to say, he did not take me up on that offer. And I think that part of the problem is that as policymakers, we are sometimes all too willing to subject other people's children to policies that we would never accept for our own. And that, in my mind, is part of the problem. That's the first thing we need to change. The second is that in America, we have entered into a time where partisan political politics actually rule the day. And so we are no longer thinking about things from is this a good policy perspective? We look at everything through the lens of our party politics. So I will give you an example of this. I am a Democrat. I have always been a Democrat, always will be. I'm proud of it. But my party has very, very clear lines of what we want and what we don't want as it pertains to education reform. And so I came into the job with those exact same lines. And one place where I drew a very bright line was around school vouchers, the ability to take public dollars and use them at private schools. So the Democrats in the US don't like vouchers because the idea is, well, you're going to take money away from the very schools that need it the most, or you're going to throw a life preserver out to a small percentage of kids. What about the rest of the kids, et cetera? And so I bought into all of those arguments and was against vouchers. But when I got to DC, there was a publicly funded voucher program that was about to be reauthorized, and people wanted to know what my opinion was. So, you're one of the most influential people and education people in the city, what you weigh in. And I knew where I, was leaning, but I decided to do a little research before I weighed in. And over the course of several weeks, I talked to family after family after family in DC, mostly young single mothers, who had done exactly what you would have wanted a mom to do. So she first researches her neighborhood school and figures out only 10% of the kids at the school are on grade level. My kid has a 90% chance of failure. That is not okay for me, so I'm not going to send my child there. And then she would do the next best thing that we would recommend, which is that she would apply through the out-of-boundary lottery process to try to get her kid accepted at one of the good schools across town in a wealthy neighborhood. And inevitably, she would lose the lottery because there were thousands of applicants and only a handful of spaces. And then these mothers would come to me, sit down at the table across from me and say, now what do I do? And the reality was that in running the public school system, I did not have spaces at a school that I would feel comfortable sending my own kids to available for those mothers. And so I thought to myself, who am I to stop this woman from taking a $7,500 voucher, which, by the way, was a lot less than what we were spending per child, and potentially, go to a Catholic school, and this child could be saved from a most unfortunate fate if they would have stayed in this failing school. I said, I'm not going to stop anybody from doing that. I simply can't look another mother in the eye and say, honey, you're just going to have to suck it up for 5 years. That's how long I need to fix the system. Your kid may not learn how to read, but that's what I need. No, because this wasn't about me or the system or the district. We had to start making decisions based on children. So when I came out in favor of the voucher program, people went nuts. The party said, you're going against the party. What are you doing? And, the most vocal opposition was actually from my supporters. People who said to me, Michelle, you're crazy. We think that you can actually be successful, but you have to give yourself a chance for that success, which means that you shouldn't be encouraging kids to leave the system. You need to keep them in the system so you can make it better. And I said, here's the problem with your thinking. My job is not to protect and preserve a district that has been doing a disservice to children. My job is to make sure that every kid in the city gets a great education. I am agnostic as to the delivery mechanism. As long as it's a great school, I don't care if it's a charter school or private school through a voucher, as long as it is serving kids well, it's good with me. So I have tried over time to win as many of my Democratic colleagues over to this as I can. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But a very, very good friend of mine who's a public school teacher and I were having this argument, and I laid all that stuff out for her, and she looked at me at the end and she said, yeah, no, I'm not buying it. And I said, okay, well, let me try one more thing. I said, Waiting for Superman. Did you see the movie? Did anybody in the room see the movie Waiting for Superman? So if you haven't, you should. But it chronicles 5 families throughout America who are trying to, desperately to find a good school for their child. Anyways, there's a scene in the movie, a very poignant scene, where a little girl is not able to go to school because her mother has fallen behind $500 on the tuition payments for the private school that she goes to across the street. And so she's crying because she can't go to her, school. And I asked my friend, I said, Bianca, in the movie, she was not allowed to attend her kindergarten graduation. What did you think about that? And my friend said, it was heart-wrenching. It was an injustice. I wanted to write the check myself. I said, right, honey, that would be a voucher. So when you look at things from the vantage point of individual children, it's very, very difficult to say we are not going to provide these opportunities for children because of our political leanings one way or another. I guarantee you that in America, if we stop thinking about things as Republican policies or Democratic policies, and instead focused on passing policies that were good and right for kids, that we would end up with an agenda that was a students first agenda, which I guarantee you would put the country on a wildly different trajectory in terms of the quality of education that we're providing kids. Let me just end on this. I believe that public education is the great equalizer. It's supposed to be the thing that ensures that it doesn't matter if you're black or white, rich or poor. Every child should have an equal shot in life because they're able to get a high quality education. That's in America, that's the ideal on which we were founded. That's not the reality that children face today. In fact, America has fallen towards the bottom of the international rankings on social mobility, which means that if you are a child born into poverty in America today, the chances that you will ever escape poverty are slim to none. That goes against every ideal that we have as a country. And I refuse to sort of subscribe to the belief that, well, poor people, because they're poor, they're always going to be poor. Education is the way out. Education is the sort of proven way to ensure that you are breaking cycles of generational poverty. And that's why the work that the Secretary, that Rachel, that others are doing here is so incredibly important. And I do believe that it has the potential to put this country on a different trajectory as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. There's a huge amount there. It's interesting when you think about school policy, it's interesting when you think about kind of bigger change management more generally. It's interesting on the way American politics and city politics work. So I'm sure there'll be lots of questions and answers. We have a little bit of time. We might take a couple together. If you say who you are and where you're from, that'd be very helpful. So we're going to take 2 gentlemen in the second to back row, and if you just wait for the mic, we'll come to you. We'll take these 2 together.
Great, thank you. Michael Day from Teaching Agency in DFE. I was really interested, Michelle, in your setting out how we should look at the system through the eyes of how we educate our own children. And just an anecdote, one of the more depressing things that happened to me this year was hearing a professor in one of our leading universities talking about recruiting people onto teacher training courses and saying, to amusement, his amusement and that of the audience, that he regularly recruited people who would not dream of letting his children be taught by. And I think that's the kind of exactly the reflection you're going for. In England, we're putting a lot of effort now into getting schools much more involved in the selection and recruitment of teachers. And you've spoken a lot about the problems of having underperforming teachers in the system and how you have to deal with that. I wonder whether you can say anything about what's happening in America about trying to make sure you get the right people into the profession in the first place, rather than having to deal with issues of underperformance once you recruited the wrong teachers.
Okay, let's hold that thought for a second. It's a good question. So.
John Haines, Senior Consultant, Education International. And I agree with you, Michelle, on your last point about getting children who are in the greatest poverty to achieve. Absolutely, that should be the point of a central point of the education system. But I suppose my question is, and I've worked quite closely with a lot of colleagues in America, is what's your relationship with teacher organisations and unions? Do you agree, for example, with the OECD that strong and successful education systems are characterised by strong proactive teacher unions? That's my first question. My second question is that, yes, I agree with you about education being bedeviled by party politics, but to a certain extent you can be bedeviled by sponsors who might be a problem as well. We've got a Leveson inquiry in this country, and I'm just wondering what you think about your relationship with Murdoch, for example, in terms of sponsoring StudentsFirst. And I think that's a genuine question, given the level of sponsorship that there is in the United States.
So I'll answer your question first. I absolutely believe that it is necessary to change the teaching profession such that it is a profession that absolutely can recruit and retain the best quality teachers. In the United States, if you look at schools of education, they typically have the lowest SAT averages, the lowest GPAs, etc. So we are not choosing our future teaching force from the best. If you juxtapose that with countries that have some of the best education systems in the world, for South Korea, for example, South Korea, where I'm from, it's harder to become a teacher in South Korea than it is to become a doctor in America. And so that is part of what we have to change. But until we change the culture and the system in which the professionals have to operate, I think it's going to be very difficult to recruit the best and retain the best people. So for example, as long as we have last in, first out policies where professionals know that it doesn't matter how good I am, if I'm the last person to hire, I'm going to be the first to go, regardless. That's not a profession that is going to incent high achievers to come into it. So we really do have to change the way that we're structured. Another thing is the pay piece, which teachers don't go into teaching because of the pay, obviously. But does it matter? Of course it does. And when we set up the structure that allowed us to pay our most highly effective teachers double the amount of money that they had been making in the past, they all of a sudden knew that they were valued and respected for the incredibly difficult work that they were doing. So I think a lot of that does have to happen. To the gentleman over here, in terms of our relationships with the unions, a lot of people sort of in America like to say, well, unions are the problem. How are we going to get teachers' unions on board with reforms? And I actually don't believe that the teachers' unions are the end-all be-all problem to the troubles that we face today. The teachers' unions are doing exactly what they are supposed to do. Their job is to protect the rights, privileges, and pay of their members, and they are doing a bang-up job of that. So you can't begrudge them that. The problem is not that the teachers' unions exist. The problem is that we don't have an organized national interest group with the same heft as the teachers' union that is advocating on behalf of children. So when you have a very powerful interest group that's advocating for adult interests, and then you have nobody representing the children, you end up with a very skewed policy and legislative landscape. And that is what I think is the problem. So not so much the teachers' union, is that we need to build up a national force that's going to advocate on behalf of the kids. That's why I started with Students First. And to your last question, look, the bottom line for me is that we have 1.4 million members across the country. I don't talk about individual donors at all, but the vast majority of our donors are everyday people who care about kids and who want to fix the system. Our average donation is about $84. So we focus less on kind of who and why and what people know when they invest in us as Students First is that we are going to make every single decision based on what we believe is in the interest of kids.
How did you get so many members? I mean, that strikes me as an extraordinarily scaled organization. I had no idea before reading up on it.
Well, we were very fortunate in that we were able to launch the organization on the Oprah Winfrey Show. So I don't know if you know Oprah in here, but in America, Oprah is it. And so on one of her last shows before she stopped filming the Oprah Winfrey Show, she announced the creation of Students First. And it was very interesting because the guys who ran our website were the gentlemen who ran the Obama's 08 campaign website. And so when we said, we're going to get a lot of traffic, and they said, we handled Obama, don't worry about it. They obviously didn't know about Oprah, the Oprah effect, because we got so many inquiries that day that the website crashed. I think that we have hit and sort of tapped into a frustration that American citizens have felt for a long time about education. A lot of people know that the system is broken. People who are parents sort of see some of these policies play out for their kids. They're incredibly frustrated, and they've never known what they could do about it. And finally, they see sort of Students First as a solution of the way that they can get involved and enact change. And I think that's part of what has resonated with people.
Gotcha. So, gentlemen in the third row in the blue tie, and the mic will come to you, and then we'll go back.
Hi, Luke Trill from Stonewall. You obviously had some great success in DC, but ultimately the vested interests did prevail. Mayor Fenty lost re-election. So as we embark on quite radical education reforms in this country, what lessons would you give from your defeat as well as your success, and how we can ensure that the changes last and they work in the long term?
Okay, good question.
There's quite a lot of, as Patrick Watson and Trace Public Affairs, there's quite a lot of debate in the States about how to fairly measure teacher performance. Is the system in Washington seen to be fair with stakeholders? And if we were to introduce a system in this country of measuring teacher performance, what state should we look at?
Okay, so I'll take teacher evaluation first. We implemented a new system because the old system that we implemented was 100% subjective. That you were evaluated based on what the opinion of one person, which was your principal. And teachers really didn't feel like it was a fair system. They didn't feel like it was transparent. They certainly didn't feel like they were getting much professional development out of it. We created a new system where 50% of the teacher's evaluation was based on the student growth, academic growth that they saw of their kids. So not an absolute level, 90% of your kids must be a grade level of proficiency or above, because different teachers inherited different kinds of classes of kids. But rather, your children and where were their achievement levels at the beginning of the year, where did they end the year, how much did they grow? And we also created a statistical model that allowed us to control for factors that were outside of the purview of the teacher. So socioeconomic status, special education status, ELL status, et cetera, et cetera. So that made up sort of half of the evaluation. The other half of the evaluation was a mix between several factors. One was observations of classroom practice. We had 5 observations per year. Most of those were unannounced observations, but in those observations we were allowed to see how the teacher interacted, executed lessons, etc. We also had a school level measure, so that we didn't want individuals to just care about themselves. We wanted them to be invested in their schools, so part of their evaluation was based on how the school overall did. And then we had what we called contributions to school community. You know, the sort of intangibles, the things that teachers, you know, did that were above and beyond Call of Duty. I you know, coached the soccer team and the debate team, et cetera. And I think this is important because I do not think that any professional, in particular teacher, should ever be evaluated solely on the basis of one thing, test scores, et cetera. Every teacher should be evaluated based on multiple measures. You were asked a question about...
the gentleman third row was asking a question about what we could learn from the defeat
of
the elections.
That one is a tough one because the day after the election, and my staff teased me that I was the only person who thought he was actually going to win because I wasn't a politics person, so I didn't know how to read polls, etc. But the day after he lost the election, I sent him an email and I said, "Sir, I feel so terribly. I feel like I added to your defeat. It was because of we were pushing such aggressive reforms and you got such opposition and pushback that this happened." And he sent me an email back and he said, I am so proud of what we did through my term as mayor, and I believe that we did more for the children of this city than anybody has before. And so, you know, I feel proud, nothing but proud, and no remorse whatsoever for what we did, because we made every decision based on what we believed was in the best interest of kids. First of all, we need more politicians like that. So too many of the politicians in America believe that they can serve the world best simply by being reelected over and over and over again. And so they're willing to compromise their ideals and you know, their philosophy based on what's going to keep them in office. And I think we need a little less of that and more people who are sort of willing to live by the courage of their convictions. But I'd say the second thing is that we did a very poor job of communicating when our reform effort. Because I very naively thought, I'm a school superintendent. I'm not running a political campaign. I don't need a PR machine and all that sort of stuff. And so I thought, I'm just going to put my head down and I'm going to work hard and I'm going to make the decisions for kids and I'm going to produce results and people are going to like those results and want us to continue. But what I didn't realize was that the people who were opposing us had a very sophisticated communications and messaging machine, and they were pushing out messages against us, and we weren't pushing out any messages. And so in that void, their messages sort of became fact. And that was a real shortcoming on our side. And so now what my advice often to people who are taking on similar reforms is you really do have to treat this like a political campaign. You have to have your messaging together. You have to be able to explain to people why you're doing it and why it might be difficult at times and why some people are pushing back, but why you're pushing forward regardless. And I think that, to me, is one of the sort of critical pieces that anybody who's pushing effective and aggressive reforms has to have in place.
There's a gentleman in the second to last row, and then, that's you, sir? And then it's gentleman right in the front.
Chris Waldron from the Reduced Policy Company. One of the things we have in common with America is politicians who get elected over and over again. So that's not just a North American issue. Could you comment on the fact that in England we are moving to directly elected mayors, directly elected police chiefs? In the States, I think about a third of your chief state school officers are directly elected. Do you think that is another North American idea we should follow?
Very interesting question.
So I'm obviously all about democracy, but I also believe that there's a point at which you can have so much democracy that you don't have an aligned ability to move forward with actions that are necessary. That's part of the reason why my boss, the mayor, actually, when he took over the schools, he got rid of the school board. Because he saw the elected school board as a problem. These were people, for the most part, who did not know anything about education. They were using it as a stepping stone to become a city councilman or something at some point. And they were about currying favor with special interests so that they could run for those higher offices, as opposed to being people who really knew about how to run a school district. And so, I think that you have to figure out sort of how you maintain that balance. I know, I speak from personal knowledge that having popularly elected superintendents can be extraordinarily problematic because then they will face the same situation. I can't just focus on doing what's right for kids and sort of implementing the academic program as I see necessary. I have to make decisions based on whether or not I can get reelected. And so I do think there's sort of a line at which, you know, electing, where do you stop with that? You love
so is the answer no to directly elected school chiefs?
I would say to that one, no.
Brilliant, thank you very much.
There is a gentleman just about to run out of time.
Hi Michelle, my name is Adrian Fenty and I proudly serve for Educational Charity for City in London. First and foremost, I'd just like to congratulate you on your success. It's really inspirational hearing how you transform the schools in DC. My question for you is, what resources did you use in your schools to transform them into healthy learning environments? And by schemes, I mean mentoring schemes and also intervention schemes. I don't know if you are aware, City in London actually started in the States, in America, in Boston. Have you used similar schemes like that?
So first of all, I'm a huge City Year fan, and oftentimes in DC, I would have to go to community meetings where there were hundreds of people where I would be getting shouted down, and inevitably there would be a front row of red jackets who would all be there trying to support me. So I appreciate City Year, and actually the program was incredibly important part of our reform efforts, because when I got to DC, we had a few City Year Corps members. I went to an opening ceremony. I thought this is the best thing I've ever seen. I want 144 City Year Corps members so I can have one in every school. And the City Year people said to me, we have a different idea. What about if we were to cluster 10 to 12 Corps members in one school, in the most challenged schools, in the family schools, to try to help change the culture of that school? I thought it was a great idea. We started it, and it was amazing what the Corps members could do. We had them focused on reading interventions to take and tutor the children who were not on grade level in reading, and work with them in small groups and one-on-one tutoring. And what we found was that they had amazing impact on those children. We also utilized the business community in a similar mentoring kind of project with high school kids and kids who were in danger of dropping out. So I would say that anybody who is running a school district has to use all of the resources that are possible. And it's not just the resources that you have, you know, sort of in your checking account, but rather all the community resources that exist as well.
If I may ask one last question, which is about really your work with Students First and the various different political arguments and battles that are going on around the States at the moment, all kinds of different issues, all kinds of different places, and how you see the kind of the overall picture, who is, you know, how the balancing forces in these arguments changing.
Yeah. So I'd say the unfortunate place that we're in the States is that education policy and all of the debates surrounding education policy have become polarized to these extremes. Extremes where actually nobody is. So for example, after I put in place the new teacher evaluation system that I talked about, one of the opposition's favorite things to say is she wants to evaluate teachers solely on the basis of test scores. And it freaks teachers out, because I wouldn't want to be solely evaluated on the basis of test scores. I was a teacher, and you know, I wouldn't, as a chancellor, want to be solely evaluated on the basis of test scores, etc. And so part of the problem is that people hear that and they get very angst-ridden, and they begin to sort of move away. Oh, well, I don't like the reforms then, when in fact, they're operating off of misinformation. Nobody is trying to evaluate teachers solely on the basis of test scores. And in fact, the union in DC, in the States has signed on board to many evaluation systems where 35 or 40 or 45% of the evaluation is based on test scores. So if you believe that the union believes that that's right, and we believe that that's right, and what we're arguing about is whether it should be 50 or 60% or 40%, then that's a discussion we should have. We should not sort of polarize things to these extremes where actually nobody is. And that's what it's becoming. You know, the astonishing thing in these states is that if you look at polls, generally, between 70 and 80% of Americans believe in the reforms that we're talking about. And so these really are just common sense things. Should we value, recognize, and reward the highest performing teachers? Yes. Should, for the lowest performing teachers, for the ineffective teachers, should we either quickly accelerate their practice or move them out of the classroom so that they're not impacting kids anymore? Yes. Who's going to say that we shouldn't do those things? So they're not particularly controversial in and of themselves. It's the debate that has become so divisive and polarized, and that's, I think, what we have to work on in the country is kind of not being polarized and sort of talking about the substance and the meat of the policies and having the hard arguments there as opposed to sort of the personal attacks. And that's
so you do agree with working with teacher unions?
Yeah, you know, in fact, this is very interesting. So we just passed, so let me just be clear on this. Everything that I talked about that we did within the teachers union contract in DC, I did not unilaterally oppose a teachers union contract in DC. The union signed on to that contract. We negotiated it out. It was painful. It was difficult over 3 years, but they eventually signed on to that contract. So as opposed to other places that are trying to limit collective bargaining or whatever, I actually believe in collective bargaining. I believe in the rights of workers to organize and to be at the bargaining table. But from my vantage point, I'm going to fight for kids every step of the way. So I do believe that you can collaborate. What I'm not willing to do is turn a blind eye to what is happening to children in classrooms in the name of harmony amongst adults. Because I think that for far too long in the States, we have all wanted to get along and not have any controversy. And what's happened is we have created a public education system that is actually doing a disservice to children. That is not okay. So I think that there's a balance that we have to strike. We should be willing to come to the table. We should be willing to collaborate on things, where we can. But we also have to be willing to speak the truth and fight the union on issues where we believe that, they're putting the interests of their members first, which is what they should do. And I think that our job as running the schools is to put the interests of children first.
Looks like one of our former members of staff is keen to sneak in.
On that point about collective bargaining, I wonder if you could say some more about actually how necessary is it for teachers? In this country, we describe teaching as a workforce. I'm not convinced that that's quite the right word for it. It's a profession, and not all professions actually have collective bargaining. And do we really need it in teaching?
Well, here's the thing. I very, very strongly believe that teachers, at least in the United States, have been left out of a lot of the policy debates. So a lot of teachers, even reform-minded teachers, feel like the reforms have been done to them instead of with them. And I am a big believer that teachers are the teachers have the hardest job in the country, in my opinion. And they should be valued in society for the incredible role that they play. And they should be a part of the debate, and they should be a part of the creation of, whether it's evaluation systems or pay structures, what have you. The obvious way that can happen is through the collective bargaining process. Does it have to happen through that? I can't tell you. I don't know, I'm an expert in other professions and how they do that. But I will say that teacher voice in the reforms is absolutely crucial.
That's an interesting note to end on. Michelle, thank you so much for your speech today, your generous taking so much time to answer all of our questions. You've asked good questions, you've given us great answers that told us interesting things about these reforms, about the way you make change happen, about some interesting things about the way America works from my point of view, all of which are very useful for us to hear. Thank you to my co-hosts as well, and it only really remains for us to thank you. Commissioner Wade, thank you so much.